This podcast is sponsored by Systems Accountants, a specialist global resourcing solutions company focused exclusively on accounting technology and finance transformation.
Injuries are part of the game of rugby, but when it comes to a career-ending injury, it forces you to quickly reevaluate your life. One such person who can provide some valuable insights through his experience is former Wallabies prop Ben Darwin, who is now the director and founder of Gainline. Ben, it's a pleasure to speak to you here at the Rugby Business Network.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me.
Ben, it's been 14 years now since your professional rugby career came to an abrupt end. That moment was during the 2003 Rugby World Cup semi-final against New Zealand, where you sustained a serious neck injury that forced you into early retirement. For those who may not be familiar with that particular incident, can you briefly reflect on it?
Yeah, it was. It does seem absolutely like yesterday. We were in the 48th minute of the game. And there was a change in the lineup for the All Blacks. A guy called Dave Hewitt, who had been going okay against, came off the field, and then Case Muse came on. And Case and I have had a lot of good battles against one another. And he kind of looked across at me from their huddle as we were taking a break, and I looked across at him, and I'm like, okay, we're on here. And then went into the scrum, and I actually technically used the same technique I've been using against Dave, which had been working okay, which was maybe just going a little bit more straight and towards, I think, Kevi Mialamu. And then with Case, he just came straight across and underneath me, as all good, attacking loose heads should. And I actually got caught on Kev's left shoulder and twisted. And there was a little bit of fatigue. And I just was technically poor in that one moment. And then heard what I thought was a firecracker or something going off in the grandstand. It was actually my neck sort of dislocating. Wow. And then as I came up in the scrum, I sort of looked at him and I'd felt nothing below my chin, and I sort of said, oh, my neck. And then he actually sort of helped me down onto the ground, and I don't know who it was. We think it might have been Tana Umunga. She came out and took my mouth guard out, and then the physio came on. And one of the things I very distinctly remember was, one, looking at my arms and legs saying, well, they're not mine because I can't feel them. Wow. So therefore, it must be someone else's. And then the next thing I was sort of thinking to myself was, in those moments, like when you have a car accident, you're actually thinking quite clearly and slowly. So I thought to myself, okay, if I'm going to be a quadriplegic, I want to go back and work in computers. Okay. I want to go back to uni. And then I thought, oh, okay, well, that's sorted now, so I'm fine. And then the rest played out. But later on, I sort of became very upset when I saw my family and I saw my wife at the time. And that was more upsetting because the reality of it started to hit how close things could have been to going quite pear-shaped.
Wow. Well, you were just 27 years old at the time. When you were told by doctors that playing rugby was no longer an option, did it come as a major reality check for you in terms of what you wanted to do as a career going forward?
It wasn't a sudden phone call. It was a gradual. On the day it was, okay, you're not going to be able to play for a couple of months. We need to look into this. And there was never really one point where we said, okay, this is over. It was a case of slowly but surely coming to that recognition. But once it did hit me, it was difficult. But I actually tended to find that the harder days came probably 2 years later. Is that I always say when you have not many people suffering a ski, but when you're skiing, if you lose a ski, you kind of can keep floating along okay, but at some point you have to crash. And I found that I was kind of saying to everyone, I'm fine, no problems, but I probably crashed, 2 years later, and that's when things sort of hit a difficult time for me. And being able to kind of get through that period with a lot of sort of support from my friends. I think the hard part was all of the guys I played with were still going. It wasn't a case of you retire and you sort of come out the other end with your mates. They were all still going in that cycle, and so that was a bit lonely. The good part about it was, though, is when you retire with injury, everyone will tell you how good you were afterwards, and you're never told you're not wanted anymore. And so there's almost a retrospective glory you have in your career because everyone tells you how wonderful you are when you're retired and how good you could have been. So there's a plus and a negative to it in both ways.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, you made the switch from being a rugby player to a coach, and it seemed to be the logical and smart and successful move at the time as you worked at Australia's Super Rugby franchise teams, the Western Force and the Rebels, as well as in Japan. Looking back now, if your playing career did not end so soon, do you think you still would have chosen coaching as your next career path?
It's It's so hard to be able to tell in retrospect. I think I jumped into coaching too quickly, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I became a head coach at 27 and then a forwards coach at 28 at the Force. And I think that was, it was hard coaching guys older than you were. And I think one of the things you need to do as a coach is you need to do an apprenticeship. And I probably should have taken a longer apprenticeship before I jumped into that level. I probably would say that at the time I wasn't ready to coach at that level, but I went ahead anyway, and I did find that quite hard, particularly the Western Force. But later on, I think going back to Japan, I actually love my experiences in Japan. I love my experiences at the Melbourne Rebels.
Well, Ben, it's now been more than a decade you've been involved in professional sport. And in 2013, you decided to start up your own business, Gainline Analytics. For our listeners' benefit, I'll explain that Gainline is an operations and management consultancy with a unique perspective on success in professional sports. Where did the idea come from to create this business? And can you elaborate on what Gainline is basically all about?
Well, the first things first is I was fired from my job in Japan. I coached a Suntory for a year, and after a year, despite the fact we went undefeated, I was told my services were no longer needed. And I thought to myself, this coaching job's quite hard. So I built a database actually of players that were actually selling to clubs. That was actually just looking at all of the transfers of players, and we were looking particularly towards selling information towards French clubs. So we're saying, okay, here's all the 10 or 15,000 players around the world. And here's as best we can tell what their contract information is, where they're born, where they're, when they're available. And so that was actually something we thought was quite handy for the clubs, particularly given the market at the time. And so what I did is, as I built this database, we actually started to watch the transfers of the players. And as we started to watch the transfers of the players, we started to see that the market wasn't responding in the way that people would traditionally see teams responding. So teams were buying a ton of players and getting worse, and other teams were not buying anyone because they didn't have maybe the funds available, and they were getting better. And so I wanted to understand that, and that's actually how the company was born. Just a bit of curiosity on my behalf about why, how transfers work, portability of talent, and then it sort of became the business it is now over the next couple of years.
Well, rugby is just one of the sports on the list which Gainline is involved with. The common theme, though, which runs through them all is that they are sports that use teamwork. Why is this the focus instead of looking at each individual player?
Well, what we've actually found through the work is that how a team is actually structured will actually have more of an input as to whether it's successful or not. And, particularly when you look at, say, the way that South African rugby organised the Super Rugby teams in the late 90s, which was grouping all of the Currie Cup teams under the various Super Rugby teams. And even though the idea of that was to make sure all of the best talent in South Africa was flowing up, it actually had quite a negative impact on the performance. Now, when you actually look at the teams that are more what we would call vertically aligned, like the Lions are or the Bulls have been, those actually seem to be the clubs that do much better. So we're actually finding it's the structure of the way the teams are put together and they're aligned, the players are aligned with each other, that actually has a greater impact on performance than simply the skill of the individual. So, the average in sport or business, the average time it takes someone to transfer clubs and hit their peak is 3 years. And so if you take that notion, if you're filling your club or your team with transferred athletes, then you're going to be quite drastically underperforming.
On your website, www.gainline.biz, it says you offer your clients solutions that are grounded in evidence and real-world experience. Can you mention some of the clients that have used your services, and were there any interesting and significant changes to their teams?
So we don't necessarily mention the individual clubs that we've worked with, but we could say we've worked with clubs, one of the top 4 clubs in the EPL. We've worked with a number of clubs now in Super Rugby, Big Bash cricket, which is 2020 cricket here in Australia. We've worked with some national bodies for rugby league and also state-based bodies for rugby league. And it's really interesting is that we basically find the fundamentals are the same for each sport. However, the context really is driven out of the competition. So if you take the top 14, for example, there's no continuity in any of the top 14 teams, basically, except maybe a Clermont for a period of time and Toulouse probably 2 or 3 years ago. And so, that's an environment that actually does not foster talent development. So we should actually talk about the stability of the competition the stability of the team is actually what drives skill acquisition of the athletes. And so we find that basically when players go to France, they don't seem to get any better. And it's a really interesting scenario. And if you particularly look at the Springboks at the moment, is what happens when guys come back from France and into the Springboks. They're finding it quite hard to align those guys. And, a lot of what we've found, particularly around national bodies, is not actually saying you need to be looking at getting the best into your team, but what is actually going to give you the best output. And I think that's certainly where, Australian rugby, South African rugby has really lost its way quite a bit.
Well, in 2016, when New Zealand were beaten by Ireland in Chicago, it came as a bit of a shock, but apparently not so much for you, as you actually predicted the outcome beforehand. Tell us that story.
Yeah, there's sort of one of the two big ones we've had, which have been a good guess. One was the Japan over South Africa, and the other one was Ireland over New Zealand. And that was a couple of issues. One was that, over the past 10 years, everyone thinks the All Blacks have been getting better, whereas we've actually found statistically they've been getting worse.
Wow.
And, they've actually been getting worse and worse. But because they're playing in the Rugby Championship, people expect all of a sudden that they are the standard bearer. The issue is that Australia and South Africa has actually been getting worse at a faster rate, mainly because of the domestic drivers that have been impacting performance. So we knew there was a real misalignment of understanding. I mean, the last time the Irish had played, the All Blacks only lost in the last minute with the retaken, conversion. So we knew that the form lines were way off the mark, particularly as I think the line for that game was, 12 points or maybe even 20 points. I can't quite remember. It was very, very high. The other part was what we call positional interdependence. So, they were running with two locks who really had not played lock. One was Kaino, the other one was Tui Tupelotu. I'm going to get my pronunciations wrong. And we also know centres is extremely important. So when you take those two out, centres and locks, your team's got a really strong chance of underperforming. And that's what happened reasonably within the context of that game. And it wasn't really the case we said Ireland will definitely win. We just said that whoever's setting the margins on this game is way off the mark because they're simply taking form lines which were not appropriate for that performance.
From a business startup perspective, Ben, what challenges did you experience when forming Gainline 4 years ago? And what advice would you offer retiring professional rugby players looking to create a business of their own?
I think the biggest challenges we've found as a business is that we try to really put the mirror back onto governance. Is that governance is fundamentally the main driver of success or failure in sport. And that's not necessarily a message that clubs want to hear. They really like to be able to say, no, it's the coach or it's the players. They're the ones who are letting us down. And we're actually saying that we have this theory, which is skill times cohesion equals capacity. And we can't find a single coach in the world that can function above capacity. So even when Graham Henry coached Wales, he couldn't fix the problems at Wales until the system fixed itself. And so that's probably been one of the great challenges, is that it's not necessarily a popular message. So we've tried to say, well, it might be easier for us to assess than it is to influence. I think in terms of people and their, what they want to do with their post-career, I definitely say take your time. It took me, almost 10 years now to sort of find exactly what I wanted to do. And I think there's when you're playing, there's a feeling of pressure and a limelight that people are watching what I'm going to do, and it needs to be as impressive as when I played. And that's simply not plausible. You're never going to be able to outstrip anything you did as a player with what you do in retirement. So the key is to go back and say, what do I really enjoy? And focus on what you enjoy, and then you'll eventually be able to build a business out of it. But, I think that it's not something that comes quickly, and it's something that takes time. And you have to move on from playing and the highs and lows and understand, life after that is fairly flat. But there's other things that are satisfying about it.
That's great advice. How can businesses get involved with Gainline? Is there room for collaboration on your part?
Yeah, we are. We're definitely interested in collaboration. We're having some discussions with universities at this point. We're building a system of an ability to be able to make to work with companies. We actually can map companies. We've started doing that quite a lot. And we're actually finding that that systems that we look at, whether they're teams or not, it doesn't actually matter whether it's in sport. In fact, most of our research comes from a form of almost historical anthropology rather than, sports data analytics. We're actually take most of our data from NASA from Harvard Business School, from armies, than we actually do from sport. We just apply it to sport because it's a really easy turnaround and really easy to measure given the week-to-week changes. So we actually find we have more in common in our business sense with perhaps non-sporting organisations. And so we're definitely open to having conversations with people about what we do.
Oh, brilliant. Finally, Ben, I'd like to end off by looking at the British and Irish Lions tour of New Zealand. What outcome are you expecting based specifically on an analytical approach and data? What do you foresee?
Well, fundamentally, even if the Lions have a better team, they should lose the series.
Okay.
In terms of even when they have better individuals, the system works against them being successful because it's very difficult to bring those 5 teams together. So it's really going to come down to what Gatland puts on the field. And, when he's shown bias towards the Welsh or the English is when they've done their best. So you particularly look at the third test against Australia last time, is he actually said afterwards, you're going to have to make me be even-handed in the way that I pick the team, because he took out O'Driscoll, he put in Welsh centres and actually played better, even though O'Driscoll is individually a better player. So it's going to come down to the sides that he picks and how biased he is. And unfortunately, for the purists, that may not necessarily be the most representative side. And you can see in the way that he's picked the team, he's definitely shown a Welsh bias in terms of the squad development. But fundamentally, if New Zealand are on song, they should be able to get over the top of them, particularly if they've shown their sort of, mild bias towards a Crusaders forward pack and a Hurricanes backline. So my biggest concern for the All Blacks is actually in the centres. I think that's where they lack consistency, and that's where we find that defensively they can fall over. But that's only one weakness. The Lions have got weaknesses across the board, not in their individual skill, but in the way that the team's actually moulded and particularly their ability to defend. So I think you'll find no matter what, it's going to be high scoring. There's going to be a lot of points put on the Lions. It's whether they can counterpunch that and win a shootout in a high-scoring game that'll sort of tell us the outcome of the series.
It is going to be an interesting series indeed. Well, Ben, thank you for providing a fascinating insight into rugby and other team sports from the perspective of what services you provide at Gainline. And we at the Rugby Business Network hope that you continue to grow from strength to strength.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.